Hello, everybody.
Good afternoon, sir. Can you hear us well?
Yeah,
Okay, perfect. I think that's everyone. We're 3 on the clock, so let's just give it another minute and then we can start.
what is that? Yeah, now it's okay. There was some sound which was coming. I don't know what was that. Yeah.
We start to hear your construction, yeah.
hmm Some construction work. Yeah, yeah. hmm So, what is the audience size in this?
Great. Well, hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Bhaskar. I'm one of the co-founders of eDRV. I'd like to welcome all of you today to this joint webinar on advancing EV charging in India with interoperability. Today's webinar is being co-hosted by the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, the Center of Energy Finance, and eDRV. eDRV, we've been working with CEEW for the last 6 months. We are a electric vehicle technology venture with the mission of removing barriers to adoption of EV charging infrastructure. We have a very exciting lineup of speakers for you this afternoon. First off, we will have a keynote address by Mr. Anil Srivastava from Niti Aayog. We have an illustrated set of panelists today, including Mr. Mohan from ESL, Dr. Shalini Sareen from Electromobilitat, and Mr. Roland Favarda from the Roaming Foundation. This panel will be moderated by Kanika Chawla from Council on Energy, Environment and Water. But before we start, I'd like to invite my colleague Siddharth to give us an introduction about interoperability and the work which has been done by this project till date to give us a context. So without much further ado, over to you, Siddharth.
Thank you, Bhaskar. Let me just share my screen. I hope you can all see it. Thank you all for joining today's webinar on advancing EV charging in India with interoperability. Interoperability is a term that one increasingly hears in the EV charging space in India. And this webinar intends to demystify this term as well as examine the impact that interoperability or EV roaming may play in the electric mobility ecosystem in India going forward. My name is Siddharth, and I'm the lead consultant at CEEW Center for Energy Finance. And I'll just set the context for interoperability, EV roaming, and the EV charging space in India for the discussion today. Bhaskar's already covered this, but very briefly, I'll just set the context today, after which we'll have a keynote address by Mr. Anil Srivastava, following which there'll be a panel discussion and a Q&A session. with the panelists today. That'll be moderated by Kanika Chawla, and my colleague Meghna will conclude the session today with her remarks. So what is interoperability and how does it play into EV roaming? Interoperability is essentially the compatibility of key hardware and software components that make up EV charging. And by standardizing these various technologies, you're able to make the EV charging experience seamless and integrated. So a number of you in the EV charging space would know about a protocol such as OCPP that enables EV hardware and the backend software to work together, regardless of the manufacturer or any other restrictions. And similarly, for those of us in India, we're quite familiar with technologies such as UPI, which allow us to transfer money from one provider to another seamlessly. The same idea is to be extended to other parts of the EV charging ecosystem. And this interoperability really enables EV roaming, in which users may access multiple charging providers through a single app or account. And an analogy can be drawn here with telecom roaming, in which one can use a single SIM card to access multiple mobile networks, regardless of their travel across state or national boundaries. And the same idea can now be implemented in the EV space by implementing interoperability. EV roaming is not new. It has already been implemented in countries in which electric mobility has been advanced, such as those of Europe, and increasingly in North America as well. And the idea is that EV roaming, if brought to India, may offer some of those key benefits in the Indian market as well. So just to examine what some of those benefits might be, it's useful to look at the impact across three layers, at the heart of which are the EV users. So EV users, by being able to see all the EV charging points on a single app or platform, are able to access consistent service. They're able to get their range anxiety gets reduced. They're able to transparently compare services, costs, and other features, and they are able to travel across boundaries, those of the city or even the state in India. At the industry front, you have the charge point operators or the mobility service providers, which are able to access a wider customer base. They're able to get better utilization and therefore improve their profitability of their service. They're able to expand to newer geographies through collaboration with other charge point operators or mobility service providers. And they're able to access hardware from any manufacturer, regardless of their source, by sourcing standardized hardware. And by aggregating supply for users and aggregating demand for the industry, the entire EV ecosystem benefits, because you're able to unlock these network effects. Essentially, you get faster EV adoption. You're able to attract greater investment into the electric mobility space. There's much more competition and much more players in the market, and the entire EV transition is essentially accelerated. Their core message here for India, as far as EV roaming is concerned, is that by introducing interoperability, you're able to speed up the transition that is envisaged through better EV charging experience for users, as well as improving the business viability of EV charging as an industry for service providers. And this is really the aim for the project that is currently underway by the two partners, the Council of Energy, Environment and Water and eDRV. This project started in July of this year, and with the aim to lay the groundwork for EV roaming in the public charging space for India. The project is very much focused on wired charging and intends to to provide recommendations in the form of a final report, as well as demonstrate viability of EV roaming and interoperability through a pilot. The project is expected to conclude in March 2021, and this is the first webinar that we are organizing to inform the general public about this topic. So without further ado, let me just run a quick poll for the audience that we have here today. Sachin, if I may request you to release the poll, we have two simple questions for you. Sachin, could you release the poll, please? There we go. So the first question is, which type of charging should be made interoperable first? You have three options: public charging, which is accessible to everyone; semi-public, which is sort of restricted in access or timing; and private or captive charging, which is restricted to only very limited set of users. The second question is, what is the biggest benefit that you think will come from introducing EV roaming to India? And you have four options there. Please let us know your thoughts. We'll give you 10 seconds to note down your options. Right, I hope you've all voted. Sachin, if I could request you to close the poll now, and we'll share the results just before the panel discussion. So with that, may I now request our keynote speaker, Mr. Anil Srivastava, who formerly headed the e-mobility mission for India at Niti Aayog, to kindly address the audience with his keynote speech. Mr. Srivastava, over to you.
Thank you, Siddharth, and a very good afternoon to everybody and all the audience. It's a very interesting and very timely topic on which we are discussing today, and I compliment both the organizations to take it forward and work on it. I hope the report which comes out and the recommendations therein would be helpful for the decision makers. Now, when we talk about charging infrastructure, or for that matter, anything in the Indian context about the adoption and the success of electric mobility, we generally tend to look at it from the global perspective and with the perspective of the developed economies and likewise. So in all the forums and everywhere, I do say that India is different. Our automobile mix is different, and we generally tend to not really ignore, but somehow find it very convenient not to put a proper emphasis to the Indian conditions. Now, where more than 80% of the vehicles are two-wheelers and three-wheelers, and the rightly so in its wisdom, particularly after the FAME 1, when we decided on the FAME 2, we put focus on the two-wheeler, three-wheelers and the public transportation system, because their contribution to the pollution, to the environment and everything was taken into account, while putting more than rather the due emphasis on these modes of transportation. So when we talk about the interoperability, we talk about the as Siddharth was saying, the mobility of EVs, or the roaming of EVs, we cannot ignore these two aspects. So friends, what's happening is that when we are talking about the charging infrastructure, we are primarily discussing and talking about the charging stations or the charging infrastructure which is needed for the four-wheeler passenger vehicles, or at the most for the aggregators or the fleet operators. But it is much beyond it that we cannot ignore. Now, so another thing very specific about India is that the energy supply for the mobility and for the vehicles is controlled by the PSUs in India so far. I mean, it was tried, but not much success has been given while we try to give it to the Reliance and other operators. But predominantly, rather the overwhelmingly, the energy supply to the automobile, to the mobility means of mobility is in the public sector, in the hands of the public sector. So whatever solution do we try to arrive at cannot ignore the fact that we cannot rule out the role and the importance of the public sector retailing setup which is already existing. And that we tend to not take into account while we are talking about the charging infrastructure, whether it is the OEM-led charging infrastructure, whether it is the public sector or the public charging infrastructure, whether it is the independent service provider for the charging infrastructure, or whether it is the electric utilities likewise. So there are multiple options, and which are the things which have been tried globally in different countries. But in India, somehow the things are emerging, and they are in a very preliminary stage of the evolving, whereas all the options are being tried as to what should be the charging infrastructure that should be taken and who should be developing it what. So there, friends, the best thing which appears to be there, and the government had realized, and we had put the directions to the Ministry of Petroleum and the Natural Gas, that the kind of the retail outlet reach which they have, the number of diesel and the petrol, crude oil retail outlets that we have is could be a basic core or the basic infrastructure for providing the electrical charging infrastructure also. And then how do we move towards it, something which needs to be looked into. Another aspect which I must mention it here is that we did realize primarily in the Niti Aayog, while we were working for the various policies which should be there for the various department, ministry, the state governments, we did realize the importance of Indian charging standards. And not earlier, but even in 2017, mid of 2017, we started working for it, and we gave these directions to the Department of Science and Technology to come out with the Indian charging standards, realizing the size and the scale which the Indian market, India as a country offers. And that's where I mean, had it come by now, probably the question and the discussion which we are having here probably could not have been so prominent as it is right now. Because the Indian standards, what is happening is that we are following the SHADEMO, CCS2, and then the evolving charging standard which are going to be adopted. But along with that, if we have the Indian charging standards also, then it automatically leads to the interoperability and the adoption by everybody. So that is something which is on which DST is working, and they have come out with the two type of AC chargers which they have introduced, and I'm very sure that very shortly they would be commercialized. And I expect that the DST and the group which is working for the charging standard for the Indian charging standards will come out with their recommendations for the Indian charging standards, which may be one of the same, or then it will also lead to the standardization and the interoperability of the charging infrastructure. These two are the very critical points which I thought cannot be ignored while we discuss and while we work on it. Firstly, the infrastructure which is there with the retail outlets of the crude oil, petrol, and the diesel should be employed. It should be employed whether any one of the mix, whether it is the OEMs or the service provider or the public charging standards, or by the independent service providers, and even the swapping standards are using those infrastructure which is there, and they have tied up with the Indian Oil Corporation for moving ahead with their swapping standards likewise. So these two important points, friends. Along with that, what I feel is that the role of the government, which is very often talked about, yes, of course, we did work a lot, and more than 20-25 major policy announcements have been made by the various ministries and the departments of the Government of India, including the Power Ministry, Department of Heavy Industries, Ministry of Road Transport, Housing, Science and Technology, etc., Bureau of Indian Standards, etc. And along with the 15, 20 state governments came out with their electric vehicle policies. And all those policies do talk about the kind of charging infrastructure which should be there and which they are going to promote and how they are intending to be promoting it. But there has to be a commonality. But I still feel, and our stand and our opinion was that after having all these things, the role of the government should be minimal in promoting the further acceptability, adoption, and the popularity of the electric vehicles. Why so? Because we still feel that the market forces should play their role. They should be driving as to what the charging, how the charging infrastructure should be taken up and how it should be taken forward. And there, friends, the role of all the stakeholders is very critical, and that cannot be ignored. Stakeholders, in my consideration, not only the OEMs, not only the users, but also along with that, the existing ecosystem where everybody is there, that cannot be ignored, and they have to take into account as to how do we take forward the charging infrastructure and the charging interoperability. So these are the 3 or 4 salient points around which the considerations and the recommendations for the interoperability of and the standardization of the charging infrastructure should revolve. Now, charging infrastructure, the interoperability of the charging infrastructure and the standardization is critical for the promotion of the electric vehicles, to the extent that it goes along with the development of the technology. The way the battery prices are going down, and I've been told that the current prices are even less than the $100 per kilowatt hour. They have come down to that level even much earlier than the expectation from whether the Bloomberg or Morgan Stanley or any other think tank for that matter. So when the prices have gone down so much, there are vehicles which have started, the vehicles have started coming out with the range of even 500 to 700 miles in US, which is about 1,000 kilometers in the country. So we cannot ignore the fact that what kind of interoperability and the standardization that we need with those kind of vehicles, and OEMs are already going in for their standardizations. There are groups which have been formed in different countries, and China in particular has come forward with having the groups of the industries or OEMs joining for the standardizations. So these are some of the important points I thought I would put forward for the discussion here. I thank the CEEW and the EDR for inviting me for this interaction, and I think I would be present all through to have a learning from this discussion as to what is happening, so that I also enrich myself with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Srivastav. Always very good to hear from you. And I think that you've kind of identified some of the critical points. And I think that the primary being kind of that you need a fit for purpose solution for India, and we can't just blindly adopt what has happened in the rest of the world, while we can in fact learn from it. And that's actually been the effort of this eDRV CEEW collaboration, is through this multi-stakeholder group that has been convening routinely to really kind of understand what are the entry points and drivers for an interoperability protocol for India, and how can that be adopted. What should kind of the rollout plans be? And we're going to discuss some of that today as well. And today's discussion also is focused on India. The second aspect, and I think the really critical one from my point of view when I think about the importance of interoperability, is the importance of piggybacking on existing networks, right? And while you mentioned the role of petrol pumps and using that, I think the other aspect is also about, just as you said, so many different people can be charge point operators, whether they're, they can be discom led, it can be public sector unit led, and we'll hear about all the different, of course, private operators, or OEM led. But just because if I own a Mahindra electric vehicle, that should not preclude me from being able to charge at a Tata run charging station, right? And to do something just as basic as that, you need interoperability. And I think that to me, that is the most important or critical factor of this. But then the third one around the multi-stakeholder role in determining something like this, while keeping market dynamics at the forefront and keeping kind of government intervention to a limited role. And I think that that's where it'll be also interesting to hear from Roland what's happened in other parts of the world as well, and how do you manage and maintain that kind of very dynamic market space, as has been the case in all of the clean energy sectors in India. So with that, I would like to turn to our very illustrious panel. Bhaskar's already introduced them. I would like to say that for everyone who's joined us today, please do use the Q&A box. I'd like to keep this discussion really conversational. And so Mr. Srivastav and Bhaskar, please do jump in as and when you'd like. And once we have opening comments, we're going to take some of the questions and also respond to each other. But before anything else, I'd like to hear from Dr. Sareen, who's the director at Interoperability, just to try and understand what is the importance of something like interoperability. And just to kind of, before you get started, Dr. Sareen, let's quickly look at the results of the poll that we all just participated in and see if firstly, if we're in sync with each other, but also to see if we're responding to what the participants think are the most important entry points for such a protocol. So Sachin, can you just show us the results for both the questions, please? Great. So we definitely got the first one right, because the scope of our work, as Siddharth had mentioned in his presentation, is public charging. So 73% say that that's where we should be focusing our attentions. And then the second one as well, I think, is exactly what Mr. Srivastava was talking about, that customer experience and fast charging are important factors, but availability and just accessibility, I think, is so ease of use and making your user experience, which is not the same as customer experience, but just as a consumer of an electric vehicle, you have access to all charging stations. So I think I was saying the other day that if you spot a charger, you should be able to get that charger to feed you electrons, right? And that's really what we're after. So with that, Dr. Sareen, we'll turn to you.
Thank you very much, Kanika. And well, let me first begin with introducing Electromobility, which is a charge point operator based in India. And it offers comprehensive end-to-end solutions for EV charging. The entire suite of solutions from design to O&M for its customers like fleet operators, parking lots, office buildings, factories, housing, societies, and homes, of course. And we recognize that no one company has all the competencies to be successful as an EV charging operator. And it requires a robust ecosystem of partners. So we are India resellers for EV Box, the Dutch company, the Italian Alpatronics, Austrian Keba, and Spanish Control. And for two-wheelers and three-wheeler segments, we've partnered with Charge My Gadi using the fleet charging and battery swapping models. So my take on roaming, as a CPO, we do understand the value of roaming, and it has a very critical role to play for building scale and for enabling faster growth. We all understand roaming, whereby a driver, and like Siddharth explained really well, from the user perspective, from industry perspective, and from the ecosystem perspective, it was crystal clear that for the user, it is the access, the visibility, and the charging. And for the industry, or the CPO, the MSPs, all of us, it is the expansion, the new customers, the profitability, and of course, for the ecosystem, it's faster adoption, standardization, like Mr. Anil also talked about, and of course, to be able to create market competition and increase investments. So we do understand, but it's the interaction amongst them that enables roaming. And in India, there are many islands of charging infrastructure that have cropped up so far. And at best, it could be like a patchwork like we did in telecom, and typically, and then we do a lot of course corrections. So chances are, to save a few pennies today, we might end up spending millions later. And therefore, there's need to be able to better understand what would be the cost implications of introducing EV roaming while gaining on increased utilization and visibility. So while we understand the value of all that Siddharth talked about, we also at the same time need to be able to understand the implications for the users from cost perspective. And I think this is very, very important. In India, we always begin with the belief that we are very unique in India. And I mean, I've been in global companies and I know how this was always a tiff between our global headquarters and India, that India has unique needs and therefore we need to create our homegrown solutions. And sometimes we could end up with chaotic mess, spending double the amount of effort, money and time, and blame it on technology and unit economics for it. So, and we saw that in the telecom infrastructure. It was agonizing to realize that first we were setting up those metal shelters to protect the telecom electronics from dust and rain. And then we introduced the air conditioners to cool them down. And later on, we brought the batteries and the DG for the power backup. And later on, I think we overhauled the whole thing so that it could be remotely managed and monitored. So I think I'll park myself at this stage for questions later on, but I can only say technology exists. Business viability and willingness is what is very, very important now. And of course, we can talk about it after some discussions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Mohan, I think that's a really good point to turn to you. And especially because what is fit for purpose for India, I feel like no one knows as well as EESL. And EESL is also at the front line of building out some of this charging infrastructure, or at least overall driving the electric mobility transition. And then within that, you of course head the EV charging business. So you of course, are well placed to comment on this. But also I wanted to kind of come to the point that Mr. Srivastav also raised in his comments around how does this interface, what we are proposing now, how does this interface with the existing ecosystem? And how important is it for it to be kind of consistent or congruent with it, rather than kind of completely standalone and parallel?
Thanks, Kanika. Thanks, CW and E4Drive for having us on this webinar. I think taking the clue from what Shalini and Anil sir has briefed. So I think if you look at like the focus on interoperability, I think we're trying to create more access of network charging station to the drivers. So presently, I think that most of the charge point operators are operating in silos. So these are like completely like unconnected, and basically there is a difficulty that drivers feel in accessing the non-networked charging stations. Presently, I think in India, I think the most of the charging stations are built by the public sector companies and followed by some of the OEM partners and the private companies. So in India, like we have multiple charging standards, like we need to comply with the charging guidelines. So where we're building up a combination of chargers compatible with the slow and moderate chargers. And also we're trying to put up for the CCS, CharDemo and Type 2 AC protocols. So in this process, we are trying to create a kind of multifold charging protocols within a city. So although like the public sector companies are focused towards building the combination of chargers within the approved guidelines, but if you look at the other part of the private segment, they are more focused towards the OEM specific charging stations, which would be towards the Bharat DC or CCS protocol. And also like there's a more less inclination towards the CharDemo, citing there are not many vehicles which would come up in these kind of standards in next 1 to 2 years time. So we have different charging models here across India, and primarily specifically talking about the public charging stations. There is a need, I think we need to understand, like the EV drivers, when we interact with them, they say they need to download multiple mobile apps. for accessing different charging stations which are built and operated by the charge point operators. So until unless we have a kind of integration amongst the different CPUs, it would be extremely difficult to get that optimum utilization of the charging asset. And in a way, I think if we continue without having such an interoperability, we may end up losing the technology, and it can become obsolescence in coming few years time. So it's a right time for India to look at how probably at least like we can at least have this better access across the different charging station operators. So a kind of business transition could be developed, and where perhaps I think can try to help in at least like enhancing and increasing our reputation of the existing charging asset. So other point, I think that taking the clue from Siddharth's slide, I think it's very much similar to the mobile now, especially like whenever you go for an interstate or maybe like out of national boundaries, normally like we don't change the SIM. Basically like we have a different arrangement with the service provider, where perhaps I think we'll be paying a premium for such transaction, but nonetheless I think my existing network is still adequate and at least give me the required services. I think that is what I think the interoperability should bring up for Indian electric mobility. This will bring a greater confidence to the customer experience. Right now, when we speak about the electric mobility, the range anxiety is one big question mark which every customer would like to have an answer from the OEMs and the charge point operators. Now, I think the people plan in advance whenever they want to travel with electric vehicles for longer trips. They need to look at like which are nearby charging station where probably they can halt for the quick recharging of their batteries. And until unless they find their adequate charging station on those particular travel routes, they're not so comfortable using the electric vehicle for their travel needs. This is one specific area I think all the charge point operators and OEMs could cooperate. Where probably I think we can exchange transaction, we can exchange the location information to begin with. And perhaps I think we can create a kind of user experience where at least any electric vehicle user can travel by EVs and probably and where he can take up long distance travel without even worrying about whether stations would be available at those routes or not. This kind of experience I think can only happen when you have a proper interoperability norms and structure across different charge point operators, including those who are like non-network charging station operators. So maybe I think at least
yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think again, it's the kind of trade-offs that we need to consider, right? And I think that's actually what I'd like to take to Roland as well, is that when, in your experience, when interoperability standards have been adopted in other parts of the world, how have they kind of maintained the balance between some of these aspects, and what have they been optimizing for? Is it access and extending kind of range or resolving range related concerns, or is it around some of the other things that were in our poll around affordability or customer experience and things like that? So what are the entry points in other parts of the world, and how do you think that any of that would translate when we're thinking about developing this for India?
Thank you. Good morning at my end at least. I can share you. So my responsibility is as the director of the National Knowledge Platform for Charging Infrastructure in the Netherlands. I think it's kind of a worldwide leader on how we try to integrate EV charging or charging infrastructure in the whole energy system. But also we've set up the EV Roaming Foundation, focusing on interoperability based on open systems and open means. What you see happen is, yeah, it comes from different I mean, you can take different perspectives and also look at the different maturity levels that markets have. So what you have seen in Europe, that the energy players were kind of the first ones to set it up, the whole EV charging system and development. But they for a while they could stay in their own ecosystem, so to speak. It was, I think, at the point that you look at interoperability from a consumer perspective, you can take a few different levels. So first of all, it's a connector issue. Can I just plug in everywhere? Then it turned out to be a, so that would be a range anxiety one. So can I just plug in everywhere? Then you saw a payment interoperability issue. Can I pay everywhere? Well, with fast charging, you can often use a credit card terminal, but for the slow charges, it would be more difficult. And then it is really about the services level. So what's the location? What is the price? What is available? And then you see that that you need to have interoperability on a kind of information services level. And this is where the discussion in Europe currently is, that you see a lot of effort now on providing this kind of information in order to exchange charging data records between companies to assure that this user is kind of relieved of any hassle. So if you look at take the consumer perspective, it is not, I mean, in the Netherlands, we've arranged full interoperability, but if you go across the border, there is still a need. I mean, you still have no certainty. And if you like to have certainty, you still need to access 3, 4, 5 different apps because there's no single overview of all charging station in one set. So there's a lot to be done there, and you see those efforts taking place both on a market perspective, because you see the users pushing that because we becoming a more serious business, but also the European Commission is making more strict standards. They've put in legislation that says every public charging station should be accessible through a national access point with a certain basic set of data. So you see this regulatory push, you see the consumer demand, and in the end, it's like, I think like Siddhartha described, you know, there's benefits for everyone. It's just difficult to cross that hurdle. If we look at maybe a brief view on the US, United States, where you saw that it's more a startup-driven context. So new companies came to life, starting to do so the EV Connect, the charge point, of course, with a over 70% market share. And there you see that multi-location, multi-utility companies were like, okay, so I have 5 different sites and I have 5 different charging solutions on my site, and they don't connect with each other. How does that work? And you see governments saying, well, this type of lock-in is not really appreciative for the open and non-discriminatory access that I want to give my citizens. So there you see also from a regulatory, but also from a business perspective, you see the drive and the need to move to interoperability. So ChargePoint and Electrify America and Green Lots at the time, they are now also working to use OCPI then in this case as a neutral protocol with no commercial incentive behind it. So it's kind of maximizes their own interest. But they do require to be also, from that perspective, they're required to be interoperable. Is it kind of the context?
Well, no, I actually wanted to ask you a slightly speculative question. Is that what if there was no interoperability, say in Europe? Okay, what can you give us a sense of how much slower that the electric mobility transition would have been, or sort of the downside of not having it?
Yeah, so what we see today, so if we look at, let's say, the early years of France and Germany and Spain, that you see that it's been taken up by the grid operators or the energy suppliers, or the combined of those. They have stadwerken or regions or départements, as they call it. So they have specific local regions, which are far more smaller than your states, to be honest. And within that region, you know, they do a great job. They're kind of the monopolist. And outside that region, so there's just nothing will happen. So if as an EV driver, you want to drive outside that little province, then you need to, well, have a new app, have a new card, you know. So for the, let's say, for the exchange of goods and for the mobility freedom, the freedom of mobility, that would be devastating. Yeah.
Bhaskar, maybe if I can bring you in here, because you obviously understand the Indian market really well, and we've been having these discussions for quite some time now around the importance of interoperability. And I think that at a principle level, I don't think that we've come up against any opposition to the idea. So if we were to kind of then say, okay, we know what it is now, and we kind of understand what is the role that different players are going to play in this, and everyone seems to kind of like it and will benefit from it the way that Roland was also mentioning, and there's lived experience in other parts of the world. What happens now? What is the roadmap for adoption?
Yeah, thanks, Kanika. I think to echo the points that Dr. Sareen, you made earlier, and Roland, you were just talking about a minute ago. I think, well, first of all, and Mr. Srivastava, you also mentioned a lot of work has been done by the government on setting what we would call sort of the hardware interoperability. So, India is already now going down the CCS route. We have a level 2 connector. I think, Kadamo, you said, it looks like that might not, see as much adoption. So I think we've taken care of the hardware interoperability question, if you will. And I think where we are at now is a lot of the standards also now exist for the software connection. And I think, Mohan, you alluded to, the need for networks being able to exchange information around point of interest, around maybe payments can come later. But real-time information, for example, which is now not even available everywhere in Europe. So there is no real-time availability of charging stations for most, networks in the EU. And I think what that basically means is we can benefit from the international experience of how that evolution happened over the years. I think we can also look at a lot of the issues that kind of emerge down the road. So I think again, if you compare, say, the Dutch market with the French market, with say the German market, within each one of these countries you have hubs, but you see a varying degree of transparency of information. I think there's some anecdotal evidence, and I'd love to hear, Roland, if you can sort of echo on that point. But there's anecdotal evidence which says France, for example, has higher EV charging tariffs because they have not been able to move as fast or as further along on the interoperability or sharing information. So there is that disadvantage of market opacity or lack of information sharing, which then directly affects the rollout of EV charging, the price that the consumers pay, at the charging station. And I think the Netherlands would be probably one of the better examples where, it's been taken care of, it's been addressed sort of early on, head on, and as a result, the EV EV drivers sort of benefit. So I think maybe from that perspective, we in India can definitely look at the global best practices. I think OCPI is by far sort of emerging as the de facto standard, not only for peer-to-peer connections, but also for charging network and hub connections. So I think as long as we can take that best practice, use that input to implement the protocols and then start sharing some of that information, I think the learning can happen sort of more on the business side. The learning can happen on account of, how do the contracts need to be tweaked in the Indian context? How do we deal with taxation issues when, tariffs come up? I think in India, we've already heard from the government, some sort of guidelines for maximum pricing that can be charged for public charging. So I think if we already have that framework, I think a lot of the issues that came up in other countries may not be as important for India. And I think if we can kind of innovate at that level, then I think we can definitely realize, a faster or earlier adoption of roaming compared to other markets.
Yeah, I think that, so much of when we think about roaming, we think so much about the benefit to consumers. And of course, that is the sector or the part of the value chain that needs the inducement to actually adopt electric vehicles. But equally, charge point operators or just charging is a very tough business, it sounds like to me. And if you can aggregate it and get everyone to be able to use your charger, that doesn't seem like such a bad idea. So Dr. Sareen, maybe, as our charge point operator representative on this panel today, can you talk a little bit about concretely what you think are some of the benefits that would accrue to charge point operators? And just before I hand over to you, I also would like to say for all participants, this is really an introduction to EV roaming in India 101 kind of webinar. So please ask all questions. There are no dumb or bad questions at this stage. So feel free to use the Q&A box and ask your questions, and we'll also perhaps respond to some of them in the box itself and then some of them in the course of the discussion. Over to you, Dr. Saeed.
Yeah, thanks, Kanika. So I'm going to come back and refer to Siddharth's points and then, allude to what I want to bring it to. And yes, Siddharth touched upon, the immediate benefits of expansion for us and profitability, by sharing as we get access to new customers as well. And of course, through this interface, there will be easy access to the other networks for the user, and it'll improve the customer experience, enhance the customer retention, and of course, for us, improve the charger utilization vis-a-vis the captive systems. I mean, this is these are the obvious benefits. And the interoperability also allows quick operation, for any startups in a new territory, just by partnering up with an existing network. And of course, therefore, reducing the time to market and the investments. However, Kanika, let's not ignore that there could be some complications. And I just want to bring those to the table as well, and so that we are able to find solutions to mitigate them. And interoperability requires maintenance of multiple IT connections that could vary by configuration or features, and continuous maintenance of auditing backend with the back office of the various customer support teams. And then small companies may find it difficult to manage the billing in between partners for driving roaming costs. So I think there needs to be an understanding of how to be able to mitigate some of these problems. And then what would be the impact of this incremental layer on that EV user? So these are some of the questions that I would ask, besides the benefit that I would list for the CPOs.
Did any of you want to kind of directly respond to some of these complications? Roland, Bhaskar, maybe?
Maybe, okay, Roland, you go first.
Yeah, that is fine. So I very much agree with Sarin that it's we've seen in the maturity of this whole sector. In the beginning, you see 10 companies just exchanging information on a kind of ad hoc custom basis.
Yeah.
Then they find out they need to kind of have some joint database. Suddenly, you see roaming platforms appear. We see maturity in the peer-to-peer connections. Today, we see big CPOs creating separate back office solutions, such as Everon for EVBox or Greenflux last mile solutions, that really provide some kind of a mix of peer-to-peer versus roaming platform, kind of an aggregator-like function. So you see all kinds of solutions appear exactly to solve this issue, to kind of ease the life of let's say starting companies, smaller companies who like to really join that market, and at the same time acknowledging that there is also a higher level of maturity for a number of other players. So you really need to allow for these different flavors to be part of the marketplace, to at the one end provide big economies of scale, big volume, and at the other end allow for the smaller speedboats to innovate and make new ideas reality. So that's kind of the hybrid mix that you need to provide. And that's why I always say, when you look into standardization, interoperability protocols, make sure that they are not business model specific. They're kind of agnostic. So they allow for these type of innovations to appear, and also to service the smaller companies that have good ideas, but that want to enter that market.
Yeah, I just wanted to completely echo the point, Dr. Saran, you were making, and also Roland, what you just said. Definitely, and this is probably the biggest area for us to, look at, how interoperability or roaming is implemented in India in a manner that it creates or ensures that there's a level playing field. And I think by no means the idea is to create, onerous regulation which says, oh, you have to just raise the cost of maintaining an IT backend connectivity. I should say, I was speaking with a colleague in the EV charging infrastructure industry last week from Fastnet, which is one of the leading fast DC charger networks, and they were talking about the current state where they're at, where they said, the quickest implementation they've had of roaming took them 2 hours from start to finish. So you obviously expect that at a certain stage of maturity, you get to a point where it can be done very quickly. It's standard, and it's an industry standard where we as a group, sort of larger sort of ecosystem of actors, network operators, OEMs, suppliers, charge point operators come together, and we kind of come to a common understanding of what are the commercial terms, what are the pricing information, what are the APIs or whatever the protocols that need to be implemented in order to bring about roaming. But I think by no means should this be allowed to become a barrier to smaller players, or something that then favors one subset of charge point operator over another.
Mohan, just bringing you into this discussion as well, how much of what we need do we already have? Just from a regulation point of view. It seems like there is, the price of electricity for electric vehicle charging is regulated. Overall, how kind of, UPIs for charging, it's, UPIs for any kind of money transfer, that's regulated. There is generally a fair amount of regulation around, data sharing and security, etc. What is it that we need that we don't have, or is it just a matter of kind of connecting the dots and making sure that some of these market failures that have been pointed out also by Dr. Sareen are just hedged against?
Yeah, so I think the states, they have come out with a state-specific EV tariff. So normally, like there will be like the components which are involved in determining the EV tariff. One is like the tariff which is determined by the distribution company, which becomes a pass-through cost to the end customer. And subsequently, we add on the capex and the opex cost involved in building the charging stations. But I think what improvement this interoperability could bring in is, I think, the scalability. That is what the missing piece in the e-mobility segment is concerned. So right now, I think we all determine the tariff considering a lower utilization factor, because we don't have enough electric vehicles on road which can bring on high charging station demands for these public charging stations. So although we know like there are multiple charge point operators who would bring in the charging infrastructure across cities, these are being built like completely unconnected. So in a way, we are trying to build more stations in a city, which is actually not required at this point in time. So there is no sufficient demand in place which can bring in more revenue for the charging station. So invariably, like what will happen? So all the charge point operator will try to work on a very low utilization factor, which in turn will increase the end user tariff substantially, which may at least like get us some of the purchase decision by the by the consumers. So other fact, I think completely echo with Nord and Bhaskar also. I think the standardization to an extent is already in place, because most of the protocols like OCCP protocol is being followed all across the charge point operators, and even connecting with different charge point station operators is still feasible. The only thing is we need to look and rework on the interoperability with respect to operation and the payments. That is what I think the missing element in the complete ecosystem. Because right now, if you see, we had done specific pilots with some of the OEM partners, where we try to like onboard their charging station in our platform, and also like we also exposed our APIs with their platform. In a way, I think we did that exercise for a very small numbers, but it took a lot of time for us. It took almost more than 45 days time for us to do that integration part, because this was completely a new learning experience for both of us, because they being a separate charging standards and we being operating a different set of charging standards. But we agreed on a certain principle that at least let's try to work on an interoperability where the customer base could be benefited out of our mutual understanding. So we did that on a very small scale, but I think in a long way to achieve a better e-mobility in India, I think the interoperability in operation and payment has to be established. I think which requires a kind of a technology upgrade where I think a proper payment settlement could happen across multiple charge point operators, and where also this accounting and the practices are maintained. So the audit and other books could be well maintained by the charge point operator. I think that is what I think robust platform with the payment settlement arrangement has to be established for getting this interoperability going on in India.
Mr. Srivastava, if I can bring you in, one of the elements of what we're trying to do along with eDRV in this program is actually to do a pilot of the, interoperability with kind of all the relevant parties being well represented. But as a long-time policymaker, it would be interesting for us to know, and I think for everyone who's joined us today as well, is that what do decision makers need to see in terms of evidence from a proof of concept kind of pilot to actually make policy or to make a decision that actually then further advances something like interoperability and drives that regulatory push that Roland mentioned is also happening now in Europe. So what does a good pilot outcome look like for a decision maker? Are you on mute, sir?
Yeah, all the stakeholders should be on board, and particularly the OEMs. Now, if you see the current scenario, Morrison Garage is having their own charging stations. They are trying to set it up across the country, and the Tatas are also trying to set up their charging stations for the Nexon EV, which they have launched. So likewise, it is happening. So what you are doing is that a pilot project should be there, and then the stakeholders and particularly the OEMs should realize a win-win position for all of them. And that is the hard point to sell to OEMs. So the government or the decision makers would be looking forward to that. And then along with that, it's not only the question of win-win situation for all the OEMs and the stakeholders, but also the benefits which it will be accruing to the user and to the society at large. So all these aspects should be taken into account, which will give a strong plank or a strong platform to push for the interoperability and the standardization of the systems or the charging stations or the charging infrastructure. So that is very, very critical to my understanding, and that is something which is happening globally, and we are aware of it. And even the ministries are also aware of it. Is that, as the Roland was saying, that not only in Europe but other countries also coming forward with that. So that is something which should be adopted in India as quickly as possible, and I'm very sure that this initiative or the discussion will go a long way to move forward towards that.
Yeah, no, that's heartening to know. That means, sorry, Roland, did you want to come in?
No, well, if and not so much comment, but maybe add. If you mind, what we see happening also in well, at least in the Netherlands, but also I think in Europe, is that someone if the market is not yet mature and the market dynamics are not yet in place because it's just too small. And it is difficult to talk about pricing when there's no real market. So we do see public governments take a leading role there in organizing concessions, organizing contracts, maybe setting price themselves, maybe giving some subsidies for concessions during 4 years. It's Fastnet across highways. It's indeed the other people for the AC charging to first start with a network, with a basic kind of network, but also acknowledging that there needs to be some work done in order to make it a kind of a real market that has market-based prices. So I would expect that, and I would be curious to see, you know, if governments can actually step in on that end and are able to bring this forward.
Roland, it is easier to, I mean, this is for all the audience, this is easier to perceive or to look at this kind of position, but the kind of diversity which we have in our country it becomes very difficult to come forward with a single policy. Let me, it's not that I want to say something in the self-praise or in the praise of the government, but the kind of step for the first time in the electric vehicle arena, it has been felt by the industry also that the government has moved pretty fast and industry has had to follow up. For example, a simple decision like segregating a vehicle from the battery for its registration in the road transport department. I mean, that's a milestone kind of a decision, and it took so much for us. So similarly, when you are talking about the standardization, we have so many state governments, and transport is a subject which is common between the federal government and the state governments. So it becomes very difficult for us, for the government, to come out with something which could be, I mean, it is easier said than done in a country like India, the size of India and the federal structure and the diversities which we have in the country.
Actually, I wanted to say, I think one of the points that Roland made, which is really interesting as well, is of course there is the element of public money and public spending and you know, subsidies, etc., which I think is perhaps more complicated, especially with the multiple competing uses on public money. But there is also the aspect of market design, and that's around, you know, contracting, around what is the structure of the market. And I want to bring Mohan in on this again one more time, because I think that ESL can play a really important role, as it has in several other aspects of the clean energy transition, in guiding the market. And I'm wondering, Mohan, is that what you are, is that also the effort in the EV charging space? Do you want to be kind of that gold standard of what a good EV charging market space should look like, where, you know, in a way, to what Dr. Sareen was saying, is that if there is, especially as a government-led entity, one that is kind of, you know, making the right place, it also gives that umbrella coverage to other smaller players to follow that kind of template of what the market is going to eventually look like.
And the modularity.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, Kanika, I think, see, looking at the scenario now, because like in India, like we go with multiple standards. That is one reason I think there is like a pick and choose kind of approaches being followed by many of the partners. As rightly said by Anil sir also, if you look at some of the OEM partners, they go specific installation of the chargers. The Photon follows like the specific, the CCS2 protocol, and a specific, maybe like that is more specific for the four-wheeler market. But if you look at the India as a country, so we have more than like 80% like commensurate for the two and the three-wheelers. Technology, we see there is a major shift in the technology trend also, where people are looking the battery swapping solution as one of the technology which could at least take over the charging needs for electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers. If you look at that ecosystem, so since there is no standardization on the battery technology as such, the interoperability could be bit difficult across the multiple operators, since they follow different proprietary protocols for the charging the batteries. Rather, I think we could look at some of the technology which is like more standardized, especially the public charging or the standalone charging is concerned, where the protocols are defined, where they operate in a specific network locations, which becomes a good business case to explore the interoperability for the public stations. Rather, I think the ESL is also trying to do the similar approach, because we have a limitation, because we have presence in some of the major metropolitan cities like Delhi, Noida, maybe like Chennai, Hyderabad, and Bangalore. And perhaps we are also looking at some of the other locations where probably we could partner with other charge point operators who have a better presence. Instead of like we reinvesting or remobilizing our the resource and technicalities in building those stations at a cities like where already there are some station operators who have a wide network of charging stations. Perhaps I think it would be a good business for us, or a business model for us to explore the collaboration, where probably I think we can bring in a kind of improved utilization, and probably I think asset monetization could be improved. Vis-a-vis, I think we could also expect the same thing from the counterpart also. Probably I think they looking the investment in a particular city where we have a major presence. So probably I think we can onboard their customer base also, and thereby I can increase the utilization factor in my charging station, thereby at least I can reduce my tariff substantially. So this would help the end customer entirely. So I think that is the way I think we need to look at, instead of like we competing at this point in time when the market is at a maturity, at the development phase. I think we need to look at like how probably I think we can collaborate with multiple charge point operators. So probably I think we need to extend the expertise where we have the strength, and probably I think we need to look at for the support where we need to expand our base. That is how I think probably we can expand our operations, and probably then we can try to see like there's a kind of synergy could be established, where the first step could be, I think we need to create the database where probably the charge point operator could put the list of charging stations which are there for the public use. So right now, if you see like we don't have that centralized database where anyone could see like how many charging stations are there in India and how many are there in particular locations or city-wise. The first step could be, I think we need to at least like inform that let's start putting out a list of public charging station. This would bring a kind of confidence to the OEM partners and also to the buyers. So at least they can look at the database and say, yes, these are the stations which probably at least they can access in case if they own an electric vehicle. So then subsequently that comes like how probably I think we can exchange the informations between the multiple charge point. There I think probably I think we need to look at some of that like disclosure of the fees, like how these stations are charging, and probably like what kind of the protocols and what kind of connectors they have. So these kind of like I think the much internal information could be worked out. First, I think we need to have a repository information where the stations and locations could be informed with the connectors, the rating, the type, and then perhaps I think disclosing the fee could be the next step, where I think once we have an agreement in place, then probably I think we can look at like disclosing the rates also for the customers at least to decide and at least to go with the electric vehicle purchase decisions.
Very quickly, if I can do a quick self-plug. So at the CEEW Center for Energy Finance, we have an EV dashboard in which we attempt to do actually all of this. And we try and map every single charging station. It's not dynamic, but it should be. That is our effort. But for that, we actually need the charge point operators to collaborate and cooperate. But it is, I think, Mohan, you've made a really important point around that we live in there's a lot of information paucity in actually a market or a sector that is very information rich, but it's just that everybody doesn't have the same information. It's the asymmetry is actually what's causing a lot of the market failures that are either some of the ones that we are kind of trying to circumvent, and some of the ones that we are also seeing play out in kind of a slow bubble explosion kind of way, not in some big kind of way. But I think that when we think about the EV transition, we usually think of where is the car going to come from, who's going to pay for it, how many two-wheelers, how many three-wheelers, where will I charge it, land, whose jurisdiction is it? All of those are really, really important questions, but we often kind of miss this question of just because there is an electric vehicle and there is an electric charger, does that mean that the two can be married to each other? And that's not always the case, right? And that's kind of the problem that we're trying to solve. I think that we've had a really rich discussion today, but like I said, this is really just the first of many. This is not, it wasn't meant to be prescriptive. We don't have the answers yet, but at least we have a better sense of what are the kinds of questions that we need to resolve, what are the kinds of, what is the kind of evidence that needs to come out of this pilot that we want to facilitate to actually show the value of interoperability and roaming. I will quickly give the last word to Dr. Sareen and then close.
Yeah, thanks, Kanika. So while I agree with Mohan and, we need static information of locations and quickly supplement with the charging rates and display the final reserve of charge use, I have a question, and that question is more for Ronald. And Ronald, if we decide that we don't need roaming, let's say for 2 to 3 years, and maybe because of cost or whatever else, what are the pros and cons of providing roaming 3 years later? And is there a case globally where a region or a country followed this approach, and are there any learnings for us?
So that is a very interesting question. I can give a few examples, basically. So I think first you need to agree whether you go for a kind of an open system, for an open market that allows for competition. I've seen a number of countries that basically say we have a state grid operator and they will take care of it. So then it's all in public hands. But that's so there no roaming is needed, to be honest. Portugal, Luxembourg, a number of these countries went that way. They've come back from that because it's a pretty heavy burden also as a government to take on all these assets. But you could do it. If you go for the, let's say, for the market-driven model, then I mean at some point you will. So then the question would be: would you allow for drivers to charge everywhere, or would you say, okay, you know, I'm just kind of mono supplier of my own charging station and my own charging app, you know, in my own closed system, kind of a Tesla solution? And would you allow to have, let's say, 10 Tesla systems living parallel to each other? I don't think that's user-centric, to be honest, and it may be beneficial in the short run. But as soon as you say we're going to exchange information, charging data records between these systems, these closed systems, then you're going to decide on, okay, which protocols shall we use, which standards shall we use? And if you start investing in custom, dedicated one-on-one interfaces, APIs, then there will be a next phase where you say, oh, well, I've now designed this API. Well, there's new development. I need to redevelop it. So the whole development effort will be an N times M effort. Okay, and that's kind of the evolution that we've seen happening elsewhere. So maybe it would be good to standardize where there's no competition. So standardize on the parts of the value chain that where we allow competition. So we don't want to compete on plugs. Maybe we don't want to compete on services, but we may not want to compete on the infrastructure for these services. So kind of that is the road. So if you would not do any EV roaming, so I think the most strongly visual element would be 10 Tesla systems running in parallel, ignoring each other.
We don't want that.
I don't think.
It's a question of, I mean, is it possible? Yes, and that's kind of what, you know, Roland said before in France as well. You'll get these hotspots of activity, but not really a dynamic countrywide network. And is it efficient? Most definitely not, and definitely not resource efficient, right? And in countries like ours, I think that efficiency is something that is really, really important. But this discussion has been very efficient. I have learned a lot, and thank you very much for everyone who's joined us. I will give the last word to my colleague Meghna to close us off. So Meghna, over to you.
Thank you, Kanika. This honestly has been such an interesting conversation because I think it's so nice that we get to come together as an industry, all of us, and really look for ways to accelerate this transition, have conversations where we're identifying the problems that we face, and then actually working towards concrete solutions. And interoperability for us is exactly that, because we're not only looking at it to further electric mobility in India, but we also want to better the sectoral experience by filling in some of the gaps that all of you have really raised today. Just a huge thank you to all our panelists that have joined us today from various parts of the country and the world. Mr. Srivastav, Dr. Sareen, Mr. Mohan, Mr. Fawada, all of what you've brought to this webinar has just been so enriching. And it's really nice because the multiple questions that all of you have raised really motivates policy researchers like myself, because we try to answer them in the work that we do. But not just that, it also sort of gives the sector something new and very exciting to think about and work towards in the years to come. Thank you, Siddharth, for the very interesting presentation at the beginning of this, Kanika and Bhaskar for always steering the conversation as well as you do, and the entire team that's worked to put this entire webinar together. And of course, thanks to everyone that's joined us on this session today. Please feel free to write to us in case you have any questions. And yeah, I think with that, we can close. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.